John chapter 2, it's extremely interesting text. We noticed one this morning in the book of John, John chapter 8, and I think John chapter 2 is another one of those texts that just is very interesting for a lot of different reasons. Not least of which is what people have done with John chapter 2 for a long, long time. And I want to look at this chapter a little differently. We're going to talk a little bit about social drinking tonight, but I want to spend some time in John chapter 2 rather than just saying Jesus didn't do what some people say we say he did, and maybe actually look at what he did do for just a moment. And I think the more you understand what's going on in John 2, the less sense it makes that Jesus did what every country song that's ever mentioned John 2 says he did. So just want to spend a little time with that with you this evening. You might look there at verse 1. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were 6 stone water pots set there for Jewish customs of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." So they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and did not know where it came from, the servants who had drawn the water knew. The head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. So, pretty familiar text to most of us. If you've read through the book of John, you've noted this, and one of the things that John says about this is that it was the first of Jesus' miracles, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but it's certainly one of his early miracles. This is at the very beginning of his preaching ministry, probably shortly after he returns from the wilderness, having been tempted by the devil, some short time after that. And John really uses this miracle to kind of introduce the public ministry, to kind of set up and frame for us some of the things that Jesus is going to go about doing as he's teaching and preaching about the gospel of the kingdom over which he will be the king. And so John uses that as a very important stepping stone to begin talking about that period of Jesus' life. Something I think we need to point out more in this context, rather than just arguing about what Jesus made in this particular encounter, is what Jesus was actually doing here, and that was demonstrating his deity. And he does that without talking about it. He doesn't just say, "I'm God." He does something that only God could, and that is he exercises control and authority over the creative order, or the natural order we might talk about. We'll look at that a little bit more here in just a moment. So there's a lot going on here. Again, and if you're familiar with the book of John, John's going to take about 8 miracles that Jesus performs. And he's going to use those as testimony or proof that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the one that he claims. And of course, this is going to be the first of those, and it's important because of some symbolism that we find here. And again, you and I, we may not be the students of the Old Testament that we need to be, and probably don't study the Old Testament anywhere like even an average Jew would have in the first century. This would have been their textbook when they went to school, if you would. They would have been taught how to read and write by looking at their Old Testament, the laws and the prophets, as we would hear them talk about it. And their history book would have been the law and the prophets, and their civics book would have been the law, and maybe see the application in the prophets. And so they would have had an extreme familiarity. Even the most common person would have had an extreme familiarity with what was said in the prophets. And so John, I think, is using some symbolism here that we'll get to in just a moment. But let's kind of think about this idea here in verse 11. This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. For a long time that really bothered me. This is not the first miracle Jesus performs. As a matter of fact, it's not even the first miracle he performs in the book of John. he's able to tell Nathaniel and Philip things about themselves that there was no human way for him to know, and yet they acknowledge the truth of what he's saying. And as a matter of fact, it prompts them to follow Jesus and become his disciples. And so that kind of leaves us wondering, what exactly is John talking about here? The first of the signs. Well, I think his point is it's the first of these miracles that John is using to try to prove his point that Jesus is the Messiah. I think it's the first of the signs that John records that have to do with the coming of the kingdom and Jesus bringing that kingdom into being. There's several prophecies in the Old Testament that we could turn to and read about that anticipate the coming of the Messianic kingdom and use as a figure of the blessings within that kingdom the idea of wine flowing freely or milk flowing freely, crops growing in abundance. And so there was these figures, these physical figures that were intended to demonstrate a spiritual truth about the kingdom of God. Just a couple of those. Jeremiah 31, and there in verse 12. It says, "They will come and shout for joy on the height of Zion, and they will be radiant over the bounty of the Lord, over the grain and the new wine and the oil, and over the young of the flock and the herd, and their life will be like a watered garden, and they will never languish again." If you read the rest of Jeremiah chapter 31, I think it becomes pretty obvious that he has under consideration there that coming kingdom, that Messianic kingdom to come. He talks about it as Zion. Joel chapter 3, we see a similar figure. "And in that day, the day that the kingdom comes, the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk, and all the brooks of Judah will flow with water, and a spring will go out from the house of the Lord to water the valleys of Shittim." So we've got these figures that are used, and we could probably find another dozen or so in the prophets, where there's a talking about the abundance of God's blessings within the Messianic kingdom to come, and this idea of the mountains dripping with sweet wine and the hills flowing with milk is a symbolic way of expressing that. And so what you see here is Jesus, and he does this in a couple of places. You see here Jesus literally living out the symbolism. You might think about Zechariah's discussion about the Good Shepherd and how the Good Shepherd would be lowly and ride on a donkey. And then when Jesus comes in to take his place, to die as the sacrifice for the people, and to be the Good Shepherd, how does he come in? Lowly and riding on a donkey. He carries out the principle that's in Zechariah's prophecy by doing exactly what Zechariah talked about. It's kind of an on-the-nose type of illustration. And I think that's what he's doing here in John chapter 2, is he's taking this as an opportunity to say, hey, the kingdom that you've been seeking, the kingdom that the prophets talked about, it is coming and it is coming now. Well, Jesus, why should I believe that? Well, remember all those prophecies about abundance? Talking about wine flowing freely? Here we are. Here we are. And Jesus performs a miracle that accomplishes just that. Now, something else that happens here, and we've kind of already mentioned it, but I want to spend a moment thinking about just what Jesus does here. Water is turned into wine all the time. Now somebody says, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Well, a couple of things. First of all, and I don't want to spend really any time chasing down original terms that are translated wine in our Bibles. I think we make too much of those arguments sometimes. But you can look up, I think it's about 13 words between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I think there's about 3 in the New Testament, the rest of them in the Old, that are translated wine in our Bibles. And depending on which scholar you read of, some of them will say all of those words can mean either grape juice or alcoholic wine. Some of them will say 12 out of the 13. The word glucose is a little tough for me. It's actually the idea of must. It's the juice that's squeezed out of the grape by the weight of the other grapes in the wine press. A little hard for me to understand how that would be fermented, but the way it's used in Acts chapter 2, when they say these men have been drinking, kind of makes it into, leads you to believe there might have been some use in that way. But be that as it may, you got about 13 words, Hebrew and Greek, that can mean grape juice or they can mean wine, alcoholic wine. The word wine is used to translate for both terms. There's really no distinction in the New Testament or in the Old Testament. The context will almost always determine that. And we're going to notice some of those contexts here in just a moment. You know, there's a lot of places over in the prophets where Israel is accused of being drunk on wine, and he goes on to talk about the shame that comes from that. Pretty sure he's not talking about grape juice in those passages. And there's other places where the wine is coming out of the fruit that's in the cluster. Kind of hard to figure out how it turns into wine within the grape. And so those words can mean either one. And we're going to make an argument here about what's going on, but I want you to understand we're not making a semantic argument tonight. We're not going to make an argument based on a bunch of Hebrew definitions or Greek definitions. What we're going to look at is what Jesus did and ask, is that consistent with what is said about this text? Jesus, in doing this, demonstrates absolute control over the natural order, the process of nature. You see, that's what happens in a grape vineyard. Water comes from the sky, it enters the soil, the roots of the vineyard, of the vine, pull that water up, it travels through whatever process it travels through until it finds itself in the grape. And through that process of growing the grape, it turns from water that came out of the sky to Welch's, right? That's the only kind of grape juice you ought to be drinking anyway. So it turns into grape juice, as you and I understand it and recognize it. So what Jesus does here is he takes a natural process, but that natural process takes 6 to 9 months, and he does it instantly. He does it instantly. He does what the world, what the natural order requires nearly a year to do, and he does it instantly. I found it kind of interesting. The commentators are divided over whether he turned all the water in the water pots into wine, or whether it was turned into wine as the waiters were carrying it out. Either way, I really don't care. Either way, there's this instantaneous transition that is not explainable through any natural process. And so what Jesus does here, in this single act, he proves himself to be the Lord of nature. This miracle is really no different in substance than when he stands up in a boat in the middle of the sea and tells the wind to stop blowing, and the wind stops blowing. He demonstrates that he has authority and he has power over nature that no one else has. Something special is going on, Jesus is saying. I'm here to do something no one else can do. And he demonstrates that by taking this water and putting it through without the process it would naturally go through. He turns it into wine, as it's talked about in the passage. So it's a very powerful passage. There's this symbolism here that has to do with the coming kingdom and the blessings of God within that kingdom. And then there's this pretty direct statement of lordship and authority that Jesus makes simply by performing this particular miracle. So if you're sitting there and this is going on, you got to be wondering who did this. I find it kind of interesting. Nobody knew except for the waiters. So you've got to be sitting there wondering, who did this? And of course, Cana of Galilee is in a region that Jesus is going to spend a lot of time preaching in, and the crowds are going to flock to him. They're going to come and they're going to want to hear what Jesus has to say. They want to hear about this man who can exercise authority over creation and who can do so in the context of the symbolism of the coming kingdom of the Messiah. It was an important moment to them. So I want you to kind of keep that all in the back of your mind, and we're going to shift gears just a little bit. And we're going to talk about what people typically say is going on here, at least a lot of people say is going on here. If there's a passage in the Bible that people are going to turn to try to find some sort of authority for what we're going to call social drinking, it's John chapter 2. And what do I mean by social drinking? Well, I guess most literally, it's going into a crowd of people or with a crowd of people and imbibing of something alcoholic. Now, most people that are Bible students of any ilk are going to tell you that the Bible condemns drunkenness. It's kind of hard to get around that since the Bible says it so clearly in so many places. And so they're going to acknowledge or be willing to acknowledge that the Bible condemns drunkenness, but then they're going to make kind of a category shift from drunkenness to simple drinking. And, I read a lot this past week about, what is drunk and how does being drunk actually work and when are you drunk? And it's kind of interesting. There's apparently some pretty good medical evidence that drunkenness is on a scale, and that from the first drink, you are on that scale. Look, I'm not here to get that detailed or get that hyper-technical. Because I don't think the Bible requires me to do that. I think there's something much easier to see and to measure and to understand. But people will tell us that John chapter 2 is proof that the Bible does not condemn the idea of social drinking. So drinking in a social setting, not drinking for drunkenness or anything of that nature. So in doing that, the claim is made, I'm using this word very intentionally, that Jesus made and shared an intoxicating beverage. I want to use that phrase, intoxicating beverage, because I think it encompasses all of the arguments, and some of them I just don't understand. You know, some people will act as if, and this is what you're going to hear on the radio in a country music song, that what Jesus made in these water pots is what you can go down to the liquor store and buy today in a bottle, which is nonsense. They didn't have the capability of making what you can buy today. So that doesn't even make sense. They couldn't distill. There were a lot of the processes that are used today, they didn't have access to. They're used to elevate the alcohol content. So that on its face is just kind of beyond the realm of reasonable. The other thing you'll hear a lot, and a lot of gospel preachers make this point, and I don't know if it's true or not, but they'll say that what would happen is that the Jews would ferment the grape juice in order to preserve it, and then what they would do is they would dilute it with water somewhere around 20% or 80% water, 20% fermented grape juice, and in doing so they would so lower the alcoholic content, which wouldn't have been all that high anyway, that really you could have drank this and drank this and drank this and never got intoxicated. The reason I say I don't know if that's true or not is the reason often given for that, and I read it in 6 or 7 commentaries this week. The reason given is they didn't have refrigerators. And so the suggestion is the only way to preserve the grape juice was to ferment it so it wouldn't go bad, which just isn't true. As a matter of fact, there are methods that you can use to preserve grape juice that will keep it far longer than your refrigerator will. I've tested those out. I think Pat did a much, much more detailed experiment on that. I was able to keep grape juice good and sweet in my laundry room in Bradley, Arkansas. I think we had it in there until Bonnie told me to get it out. So, better part of a year. The stuff in the refrigerator that I had for control had been bad for months. By the time I tapped into that stuff and drank it, it was sweet as it could be. So I don't know that there was any reason for them to do this diluted alcohol concoction. Maybe they did in some circumstances. I don't know that. But here's what I know, and here's what I'm going to argue with you tonight. That whatever was in that water pot, it was not capable of making someone intoxicated. Whether it was wine wine as we would refer to it, that was so diluted that the alcohol content was 0.01 or something like that, or whether there was just no alcohol present in there, either way, and I'm going to lean towards none present, either way, Jesus did not make an intoxicating beverage. Someone says, why is that? Have you ever thought of the serious issues, and I mean way past social drinking? Social drinking is a marginal question in this passage. If Jesus made an intoxicating beverage and shared it, there are serious theological implications, serious implications about the nature and holiness of God, about the consistency of Scripture that are produced by this one instance. Now, as carefully constructed as the Bible is, and as easy as contradictions are to kind of weed out and dismiss and demonstrate to be either non-existent or having nothing to do with the actual text itself, why would the Lord leave something like this in there? It creates such an obvious problem. I guess the better question is, why would the Lord do something like this that would leave us in this really just very uncomfortable position in regards to who our God is and what good His Word is? And so I want you to think about that with me as we finish up the lesson. So if you're going to make an alcoholic beverage, if you're going to take grape juice and turn it into wine, there's a few things you've got to have. You've got to have the grape juice. You've got to have air. And you've got to have yeast or leaven. And you've got to have those in the right proportions. We'll joke around sometimes if we don't use the grape juice up fast enough, back when we used bottles of grape juice, if we didn't use that up fast enough and Maybe somebody poured out the trays and it tasted a little funny. We're like, ooh, it went bad. We got wine. No, you don't. That's vinegar. That's why it tastes so bad. It's vinegar. It's not sweet. It's nasty. It's grape juice that's gone bad is what it is. As a matter of fact, winemaking is actually a fairly precise thing on any level. It requires certain temperature ranges you want to talk about having a problem with refrigeration and being able to control temperature. Making wine in an arid desert community would have been exceedingly difficult in ancient times. You had to have the yeast percentage just right. You had to have the sugar content just right. Too much sugar, the yeast won't ferment, so forth and so on we could go. I make that point because of the way the Bible uses the term leaven. And I've said this before, and if you're interested, I can print out the whole list of passages. As far as I can tell, there's one verse in the whole Bible that uses leaven in a positive way. It's either just spoken of matter-of-factly or it's used as a figure for corruption and evil. And let me show you just in the New Testament. Look at Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16. And there in verse 12. Jesus makes this statement. He makes it in all of the synoptics and makes it in some of them more than once. Matthew 16, Matthew 16 and there in verse 12. Jesus, back up to verse 9, they're having some questions about Jesus and what he's wanting them to do. He says, do you not understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets full you picked up, or the 7 loaves, or the 4,000 and how many large baskets full you picked up? How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread? Listen, but beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Is he talking about something positive? You don't tell people to beware of good things, right? There's something negative that he's getting into. What is it? Well, the attitude of the Pharisees and the Sadducees was corrupting. It would corrupt your faith. It would corrupt your view of God. He's saying don't be corrupted by the Pharisees and the Sadducees in their way of thinking, their way of teaching, so forth and so on. He uses it the same way in Mark. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And we're going to see Paul using the word leaven or the idea in a very similar way. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and there in verse 6, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Well, what's wrong with yeast in bread? Nothing. That's not his point here, though, is it? There's this negative attitude toward apostolic instruction that you see throughout the book of 1 Corinthians. And he's saying to them, listen, you need to get that under control. Why? Because it's the kind of thing that will permeate the whole congregation. Is it a good thing he's talking about permeating the whole congregation? No. It's a bad thing. It's the rejection of apostolic authority. And so he uses this figure much like Jesus used the figure. There's one passage where the kingdom is referred to or compared to leaven, but even then it's a very narrow comparison. And it's the expansive nature of yeast that's under consideration. And that's it. Only place I can find in searching the Bible, the only place I can find where leaven is used, or yeast, the idea of leaven is used in a positive manner at all, that's Matthew 13 and verse 33. And it's just talking about the growth of the kingdom. So I think we have to be very careful. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 25, when Israel made sacrifices, they weren't to have any leaven on the altar. Why? Because the altar was holy. And leaven represented corruption. And so we need to be I think it helps to be aware of that and to understand. Now here's the thing. Jesus, in taking these buckets of water and turning them into whatever he turned them into, is demonstrating God's power over creation, his creative power. What happens to that symbol if he turns that into something that by the same prophets symbolically was corrupt? What does that say about God and who he is and what he is? You know, that's a question worth asking. If the Jewish people saw this idea of leaven symbolically as corruption, and here Jesus is doing something to drive their minds to recognizing that symbolizes the creation of the world and his power and role in that creation, and what he creates is corrupt, we got a problem. We got a problem. We have serious questions about the holiness of God. if that's the case. We have serious questions about the nature of God, about the power of God, about what God is able and willing to accomplish. How could corruption be used as a symbol or a representation of God's creative power? And then there's the Scripture problem. The way we know a passage in the Old or New Testament is talking about an intoxicating beverage is the context. In every one of those contexts, it's negative. And where wine itself is specifically talked about, it's condemned. Notice that with me. These are passages that we're familiar with. Proverbs 20, and there in verse 1, wine is a mocker. That sounds like God saying, have some, doesn't it? Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Well, I won't be deceived by it. You're missing the passage. That's what a mocker does. It's the idea of the court jester who fools you. That's what wine does to you. That's what God says through the wise man. Proverbs 23, and there in verse 31, listen to this. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red. That doesn't say I can't drink it. Do we really want to argue that what the wise man is saying is if you're going to drink wine, close your eyes? Is that the point that we're going to get out of the book of Proverbs? No. How am I drinking it if I can't even look on it? It's the same argument we make in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 16. Believe and be baptized, you'll be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. And our friends who don't believe in baptism say, well, it doesn't say don't be baptized and you won't be condemned. Or if you're not baptized, you will be condemned. And we say, well, of course not. How would you get to the water if you never believed? It's the same logic in Proverbs 23 and verse 31. How do you get to the point of drinking of it if you're not even looking at it? Negative, 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 condemnation, condemnation, condemnation. By the way, if I had one verse in the Bible, and I know I've talked a lot about proof texting lately, but I think I can demonstrate that's not what I'm doing here. If I had one verse in the whole Bible to use in this conversation, and I had 1 Peter 4 and verse 3, I would be completely content to say that there is no authorized non-medicinal use for alcohol. Now, Paul's going to tell Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach's sake. And if somebody wants to argue that authorizes social drinking, you might want to read that passage. It's a little for a purpose. And the only authorized purpose is for your stomach's sake, for medical reasons. It's not a social lubricant. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3, I think, demonstrates the point that I'm making. He says, the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles. The desire of the Gentiles. The lifestyle of the Gentile. The lifestyle of the one who is rejecting God. Peter says it's way past time for you to stop this. Having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. So I want to ask y'all a question. Y'all feel free to nod or shake. Are the things listed in that passage condemned? Let's all do this. All of the things in that passage are. Is there anything in that list that God is saying is okay? Well, if He is, it's the weirdest way you could possibly say it, isn't it? No, He's condemning all of these things. Well, what are these things? We know what sensuality is. We know what lust is. Context demands that it's wicked lust. We know what drunkenness is. We probably know what carousing is. We know what drinking parties are. You know, the definition of that, I looked it up. I look it up every time just to make sure I read it right. This is according to Bauer, Art and Gingrich. That refers to a social gathering at which wine was served. A drinking party. Could you give me a better definition of social drinking? The serving of alcohol at a wedding, the drinking of alcohol at an Applebee's or a Chili's with a group of friends, having some people over to the house, and opening a bottle of wine. That's the very thing talked about in this passage, drinking parties. As a matter of fact, what he does is he really does away with this idea of levels and really having to be worried about levels. He starts off with drunkenness. That idea of drunkenness, that's the idea of just drinking to excess, and it has nothing to do with whether, it doesn't matter if I'm alone or I'm in public. If I drink to excess, if I drink till I'm in a stupor, I am drunken. And then he goes with carousing. Carousing would be the idea of being out with other people and getting drunk. And then he brings that down to the lowest level that you can possibly get to. It's the drinking party. As a matter of fact, I think it's Thayer that goes on to say that it has nothing to do with quantity. I hear some of my preaching friends get up in the pulpit and talk about alcohol and talk about social drinking. And they will say, based on the Greek, that they're not comfortable condemning social drinking. I don't understand their problem. I don't understand their problem. This passage, as clearly as it possibly could, condemns the social use of alcohol. It absolutely does. And if we're going to take the same hermeneutic that we apply to instrumental music and apply it to Paul's statement to Timothy, a little for your stomach's sake. He talks about what and for what. It's the same argument we make about the piano. It's the same argument we make about singing the kinds of songs we sing. If I had come in here tonight and I had said tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to play a little music along with our singing, I imagine every one of you, I certainly hope every one of you would have said, nope. Nope, nope, nope. You're changing something. You don't have the right to change. You're changing what? So if I come in here tonight, or if Kobe had gotten up here tonight and said, these songs in our book are good, but we sing them all the time, and there's some really good songs on the pop chart, on the top 20, and we're going to sing some of those tonight. First of all, I would have said, I don't know any of them, so I'm going to be lost. But more importantly, we would have said, no, wait a minute. Sing and make melody in your heart, doing what? Teaching and admonishing, right? If we kind of put Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3 together, and I don't even know who's on the top 20 charts anymore, but I bet that's not what they're doing. And so now we've changed purpose. We would understand that. We would understand that as clearly and quickly as we would understand anything. Take a little wine for your stomach's sake. How is that any different if we change that to some wine for social purposes? Or a lot of wine because I had a bad day? I think if we're being reasonable, we can see that we're abusing scriptures to do those kinds of things. So here we've got this passage, and this is my point. I kind of wandered off there. This is my point. I've got Peter over here preaching, and he's putting drunkenness, carousing, and drinking parties in the same context as sensuality, lust, and idolatry. He's putting it under this umbrella of the desires of the Gentiles, ungodly, unholy desires. But then I'm supposed to believe that in John chapter 2, Jesus provides the intoxicating beverage for the drinking party? Brother, let me tell you how consequential that is. If that's what's going on, this book means nothing. Because this book is either inerrant or it's worthless. And if we have that clear and obvious a contradiction, not how many horses were in a stall under some king. I'm talking about a clear and obvious contradiction about the teaching and the acting out of God's will. As obvious as this one, I don't know how to trust the God that authored this. Maybe, just maybe, Jesus didn't do what he's so often accused of doing. If he made an intoxicating beverage in John chapter 2, by the way, he didn't make a little bit. He made a couple 100 gallons. And by the way, he passed it out to people according to the argument that says this was intoxicating. He passed it out to people that had so much of this intoxicating beverage they couldn't tell the difference in the quantity, the quality anymore. So he wasn't just participating in social drinking anymore. He's now participating in drunkenness. Any way you count it. If that's right, then God is the source of corruption. And we have a pretty massive contradiction of Scripture. And brother, our faith rests in the holiness of God and the truth of His Word. If we don't have those, we don't have anything. We don't have anything. And so I think we need to be aware, and I think we need to understand not only what we're arguing for, if we make this point with Jesus, but the implications if Jesus did what he did, what he's often said to have done. On the other hand, if what Jesus does is provide fruit of the vine, grape juice, a common drink in all of Israel, what we have is a demonstration of his holiness in creation and the holiness of the Creator. There's a theological reason to reject this idea that Jesus made and shared an intoxicating beverage. It goes far beyond arguments about Greek words, whether we're in 1 Peter or whether we're in any wine passage in the Bible. Who is our God? Is he holy? Is his word true or not? And I really think the social drinking question is as simple as that if we'll give proper credence to these passages. And if we'll think about who it is that we're charging with the making of this intoxicating beverage. And again, noticing the whole situation, contributing to drunkenness. I appreciate your attention tonight. I know that's a little bit different approach to the subject of social drinking, but that passage bothers me. It bothers me when I hear people use that passage in the way that it's so often used, because I really think it's blasphemous for us to accuse the Creator, the Holy Lord, of doing something that's contrary to his own will, contrary to his own commandments. But I wanted to take the time tonight to show you why that's blasphemy, why that's a degradation of the character of God. And I think it really is. Because what we're called on to do is be holy because he is holy. If he's not holy, that leaves us in limbo, doesn't it? A very awkward place. I haven't talked about what we need to do to become a Christian tonight, but as I look out at this audience, I see a group of people here who know exactly what they need to do if there's sin in their lives. I want you to think about that holy Lord that we just noticed in John chapter 2 and what we saw from what he did accomplish. The abundance of God's blessings in his kingdom and the power he has over his creation. And I want you to think about your life, and if your life is representative of that, or if you have reason to believe that you're benefiting from those blessings. If not, we would love to do whatever we can do tonight to help you to be one with the God of heaven. If you have any needs, why don't you let us know right now while we stand.